I'm Nomi Joyrich, and I am the Michigan Director for Jews for a Secular Democracy. Jews for a Secular Democracy has a laser-focused mission on protecting the separation between religion and government. And we have, this is co-sponsored with Keshet, and two of our panelists are from Keshet. Keshet works for the full equality of all LGBTQ plus Jews and families in Jewish life. And we also have Senator Moss, who's a state senator from Michigan. I'll give a little bit more bio on them in a moment. But first, I want to thank all of our incredible co-sponsors. We couldn't do this work without our co-sponsors, so we're very grateful to the Workers Circle, to Temple Israel Orlando, to the Gumbiner Community Action Project of the Tucson Jewish Museum, the Jewish Community Action, or Adam Congregation of Phoenix, and the Society for Humanistic Judaism. And I want to again thank all of our co-sponsors. Today, you'll see that the chat isn't active, but if you can use the Q&A box or the chat to put in questions for the panelists, then I will be, hopefully I'll have time to get a lot of the questions. The easiest thing for me is if you put them in the Q&A. So I want to say that this conversation right now is so relevant and so important because, as we know, there are major national attacks on the LGBTQ community. There's a tremendous misuse of religion and the weaponization of religion. And this is a time when, as Jews, as queer people, as anybody who supports democracy, that we need to come together as allies. I want to give you a little bit more of a bio of our wonderful panelists. And again, thank you so much for being here. So I'm going to start with introducing Lanie Cohen. She is Keshet's Community Mobilization Manager. She believes that hope is a revolutionary act in the pursuit of social justice. Lanie earned degrees in gender and women's studies and strategic communications with a minor in intercultural global studies from the University of Denver. She previously trained communities in gender violence prevention and worked for the Colorado House Majority Leader to advance progressive policies, including the landmark Reproductive Health Equity Act. Welcome, Lanie. Rabbi Micah Buck is Keshet's Director of Education and Training. Before Keshet, Micah had the position of Coordinator of Community Chaplaincy with the Jewish Family and Children's Services of St. Louis. Micah has a BA in Jewish, Islamic, and Near Eastern Studies from Washington University in St. Louis, and an MA in Talmud and Rabbinic Literature and Rabbinic Ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary. And he has also been a SVARA, Transformative Talmud Teaching Fellow. Senator Jeremy Moss serves at Oakland County and Northwest Detroit in Michigan, and he is the president pro tem of the Michigan Senate. Jeremy chairs the Senate Elections and Ethics Committee, where he led the implementation of a constitutional amendment that expanded voting rights. Some of his many accomplishments include adding sexual orientation and gender identity to the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act, and he was named Legislator of the Year. Welcome, everybody. And I'm just going to dive right in with questions, and I am going to start with you, Senator Moss. You have been at the forefront of legislative efforts to protect LGBTQ plus rights in Michigan. Can you tell us how gender-based discrimination has shown up in state legislation in Michigan and how you personally have worked to fight it?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Nomi. Thanks for Jews for a Secular Democracy for hosting this this forum. I'm excited for the conversation. So as you mentioned in my bio, we amended what we call in Michigan the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act. There was actually no person named Elliott-Larsen. It was Rep. Elliott and Rep. Larsen who came together 50 years ago in Michigan to create a Civil Rights Act that mostly ended discrimination or provided remedies for folks facing discrimination in housing and employment and healthcare and education, created a civil rights commission where they could air their grievances, have them investigated, and seek justice. When the law was written almost 50 years ago, there were certain protected classes included in the law, like race and sex and height and weight and age and religion, among many others. Of course, when the law was written 50 years ago, it did not include sexual orientation and gender identity. But even at the time, there were activists who tried to get that language included so that if you were gay or if you were trans and you faced housing or employment discrimination, you could go to the Civil Rights Commission and you could seek justice. So for 40 years, advocates and activists tried to amend the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act to include sexual orientation and gender identity. And it kind of became a battle cry in Michigan's LGBTQ community: amend the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act. I was elected to the Michigan House in 2014. I was only the second ever out gay member of the Michigan legislature. And then in 2018 was elected as the first ever out gay member of the Michigan Senate, and really pushed and provoked this issue because all the while, real people in Michigan were facing discrimination. They were being evicted, they were being fired, they were being put out of places because of who they were, who they loved, and how they identified. So because the state couldn't take in this data, the ACLU and Equality Michigan did. And there was real data that demonstrated, there was a whole report commissioned that demonstrated that Michigan's economy was being held back because other states had remedied this. Other states had put in their laws LGBTQ discrimination protections. And because Michigan didn't, we were at an economic disadvantage. We couldn't grow our population. We couldn't attract people to come to Michigan, and not just LGBTQ folks, but straight folks who didn't want their kids or their family members or their neighbors or their colleagues to face this type of discrimination with no justice. So we pushed and pushed and pushed. And finally, in 2022, I was the campaign co-chair to bring about a first ever Democratic majority, but a pro-equality majority in the Michigan legislature. And this was finally one of the very first bills that our new majority put forward as a priority and got it past the finish line, completing this 50-year journey. Now, for the purpose of this discussion, I really want to close with this. Because Michigan was so late to the game, because we were one of the last states to add LGBTQ rights in our state civil rights law, we were actually the first state that did it without a religious exemption. So many, many years ago, decades ago, as states were protecting their LGBTQ community, they had to compromise and include religious exemptions. Oh, you know, you might be gay and I shouldn't discriminate against you, but my religious values say that this discrimination is protected, and therefore it is a license to discriminate. We had some on the other side of the aisle from me try to add those same religious exemptions into our law as we were moving forward on LGBTQ rights. And Michigan became the first state that passed a civil rights law to protect discrimination for the LGBTQ community without this license to discriminate. When it was offered as an amendment, which we voted down, I spoke on the floor about it. I'm Jewish. I'm a former board member of my synagogue. Went to a Jewish day school. I'm very well versed in Jewish studies. And you could pull any text from the Old Testament out of context and use that as a tool to discriminate, not just against LGBTQ folks, but against people based on other existing protected classes like age, like sex, like height, like weight. You could pull a bunch of quotes from the Old Testament out of context, and the whole civil rights law would be null and void, because as long as you had a religious reason to discriminate, you'd be able to discriminate. So we held this as a priority to not allow religion to be placed in our civil rights law to null and void the Civil Rights Act, and we were able to achieve it, and it is currently protecting LGBTQ folks facing discrimination in Michigan.
Thank you so much, Senator. Thank you. Um, uh, Lanie, I would like to ask you a question. From your community organizing work with Keshet, what's the day-to-day impact of the anti-LGBTQ plus policy and rhetoric, both at the state and the federal level, on everyday people's lives? What are you hearing most from those people who are directly affected?
Thank you, Nomi. Again, I'm Lanie. I use she, they pronouns. I work at Keshet doing our community mobilization work. I really see my work as having the opportunity to bring people into their political power, to be able to be a part of their community in meaningful ways by taking action to move the needle on LGBTQ plus equality. And on a personal note, before I answer on behalf of other people and what I'm seeing there, it's definitely a burden to move through the world, move through your community spaces, not knowing that maybe people around you had a very real stake in taking away your civil rights or making your life feel like there is tension between you and the world around you, and people may not be supportive of you as a queer Jewish person in the world. And I see this reflected within our communities that we work in as well. The conversations about whether trans people should have civil rights on a national scale, as we're seeing restrictions come through executive orders, through legislative attacks. Just hearing your rights debated on the national level is detrimental for trans youth and intersex youth and non-binary youth. We have statistics from the Trevor Project that really demonstrate just how scary this environment makes the reality for trans youth in particular. And one of the things we do at Keshet is really try to make sure that our Jewish community spaces can be a safe haven from the external environment that may feel really challenging. And in this moment, our community members, our Jewish community members, and our LGBTQ plus Jewish community members are looking to their Jewish spaces to help find that safety and that sense of belonging. The constant drumbeat of anti-LGBTQ plus legislation that targets trans youth really enforces that feeling of shame and fear and being under attack simply because of your identities and the way you move through the world.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Rabbi Micah, you helped us unpack the basics of gender and Judaism in our first webinar in this series. And for those of you who are watching right now, you might not be aware that this is part of a series, and you can see the first webinar with Rabbi, do you prefer Rabbi Micah or Rabbi Buck?
Rabbi Micah is fine.
Rabbi
Thank you.
Micah, okay. So on our YouTube page, you can see that webinar, and I encourage all of you to look at it. It's fantastic. Rabbi, today, can you reflect on how so-called religious freedom, I'm doing that in air quotes, arguments are being misused to target the LGBTQ plus community, and what our Jewish faith tradition really says about dignity and justice and queer rights?
Absolutely, absolutely. And first and foremost, I wanna echo and lift up what Senator Moss shared, that once we set a precedent that discrimination laws can be declared irrelevant to any context in which a person can claim a religious belief as license to discriminate, they cease to be effective as protections against discrimination. And that is a precedent that is incredibly open to abuse in all sorts of ways. And there is not a group that exists that one could not, if one were looking to, go and dig and find a sacred text from some tradition that could serve as an excuse to engage in that discrimination. That is true. And I also think it's really important to lift up that when these carve-outs and these exemptions are being crafted, there's very much an assumption of one very narrow view of what quote unquote religion is and which religions are quote unquote valid in the public sphere. And the idea that one subset of one vast and diverse collection of Christian faith traditions should be used as, this is what a religious exemption is for. This is what religious freedom means. The freedom to impose one narrow view of one religion on everyone else. To me, that's not freedom. To me, no government gets to tell me how or whether to pray, and no religion gets to tell my government who receives protections and equal benefits under the law, right? The two do not belong in positions of controlling one another. And for me, much as you can say, if you wanted to go digging for texts that put somebody else down or provide sort of a license to discriminate, for me, those are not the texts and the traditions that animate how I see my religious tradition. For me, I look to the Jewish tradition that says, you know what? As human beings, we are all accountable to one another. As human beings, we have a responsibility to see each other person as created in some way, holding whatever that word divine might mean to a person as being sort of on par with the highest value that one could hold. Right? That's what my religious freedom to practice Judaism as I see genuinely and accurately true means. And I think that needs to exist sort of in the world alongside and on equal footing with people who might interpret their faith traditions or their non-faith and non-theistic traditions differently. And I think the last thing that I want to say, and I always want to tread carefully when I'm asked to say, what does the Jewish tradition really say about X? Because we are people who have been debating and arguing and exploring together and trying to figure out how we exist in a universe of ideas for as long as there's been such a thing as a Jewish people or a Jewish civilization. But what I think it comes down to is this. I recognize that people may interpret texts in all sorts of different ways if they were going to answer the question, what would I do if I found myself in X, Y, and Z particular position? We can disagree on that. That's fine. But where I don't think that there's a lot of disagreement and dispute in the Jewish tradition is that every single person that we meet must be treated with dignity and with care, is an integral part of their communities, and is deserving of equality, rights, and respect.
And Lanie, I feel like I might have cut you off when you look like you were about to say something else. So I apologize for that.
No, that's really fine because Micah touched on a big part of what I was gonna say is that, and so did Senator Moss, is that it is so painful to see religion being used to justify harm, especially in the name of religious liberty. And that is such a big part of our work, is to really say, this is not our version of religion. If you're going to hold on to religion as a moral guide, we can really help rewrite that narrative and share that our LGBTQ plus community members are essential members of our society, created in the divine image, and also the reason why we engage in this advocacy so adamantly.
Can I add something in here too?
Yes, please.
Is that, I'm not a rabbi, but I certainly have called my rabbi as we've grappled through these issues in the legislature. And the main theme of the Bible is treat others how you'd want to be treated. There are scores and scores and scores of texts that follow that. And if you want to pluck one little piece of Leviticus to wrap your whole religious dogma around, you're missing the point.
That's an excellent point. And I'm gonna, first of all, I want to remind everybody, if you have any questions, I have a couple questions that are in the Q&A, but if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in. And the first one, it's kind of a long question, but I don't know how to shorten it, so I'm just going to read all of this. As a GSA advisor and high school teacher, as well as a Jewish person, I feel threatened by the presence of a new club at my school, the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. To me, having a club on campus at a public school that requires its student leaders to take an oath stating that they denounce homosexuality and any marriage other than between a man and a woman, as well as stating gender identity assigned at birth, I feel that this club goes against the separation of church and state. However, I see the courts have sided with the FCA when schools have limited the organization's chapter's reach and power within the school. As a GSA advisor, I would never have my leaders take an oath saying that Christians are inherently bad or I don't deserve to exist. I worry about my own LGBTQ students as well as those athletes who are in the closet and will feel intimidated. Do you have any suggestions for how I can handle the presence of this new club at my school? And I'm just gonna throw that out for whoever wants to stab at that.
No, I'll say this, maybe to lead off and from the 30,000-foot view, because obviously I don't know the specific circumstances. But these issues are going to be grappled with in the court, and there's a composition of the court right now that has provided a challenging route for those who want to further separate the church and state, and we're in a challenging era, and I think that's obvious. But it is all the more important to be visible and show up and find like-minded people to use your protection of speech to express yourself. Find those that agree with you, that you can build community with, that you can grow support for the issues that you care about, specifically LGBTQ rights. And there's always going to be people on the other side of any issue that you advocate for that are also going to be finding that they're protected under the same constitutional rights that you're afforded. So it's challenging, but there are always going to be people with opposing views. The goal is to find like-minded people to build your community with and promote your goals that you want to achieve.
Thank you. Do either of you want to weigh in more on this question? It looked like you were nodding your head, Rabbi Micah, like there was something you wanted to say about this.
I was nodding in agreement.
Okay. I want to add, I used to be a school social worker. I was a high school social worker for many years for the Seattle Public Schools, and there was a Christian prayer group that was also a student chapter, which I was upset about myself. This was a long time ago, decades ago. And I was told, that any student chapter had the right to exist as long as they, as long as they weren't excluding anybody from their charter. So there was a student group that started a satanic student group. And they were like, if they get to have a Christian prayer group, we get to have a student satanic group. And that did pretty much shut down the all of the religious-based groups.
Can I add a layer onto that? I don't want
Yes,
to monopolize, but yeah, it's exactly right. I think in our country, if you promote one, you have to promote all or none. And so even in the state of Michigan, we have holiday displays during December that are on the front lawn of the Capitol. And every group has to be included. And there is indeed a satanic display during the holiday season because they are afforded their constitutionally protected spot on the front lawn of the state capitol, just as any other creche or menorah is as well. So, if you provide for one group, you have to provide for all. So everybody gets their freedom of expression, speech, and religion in this country.
Although I would say, Senator, being from your state and having seen these displays many times myself, that they're not exactly equal in size.
That's a fight for another day. I don't disagree with you.
Right. I'd like to ask this question. I attend a Catholic university led by a Jewish president. They had trainings over the winter for faculty on LGBTQ rights. The public announcements said they were at risk for losing federal funding due to comments being made by faculty that were negative about LGBTQ. Is this kind of protection in higher education at risk now with changes at the federal level? Does anyone have any insight into the risks of LGBTQ protections at universities?
I think that
Go ahead.
Lanie.
Oh, that's okay. I was just going to say that I think it's really important to make sure that we're also examining what the state statute says in these circumstances, because there might be protections afforded under your state constitution that vary from federal protections or threats. And so we can find ways to nestle under protections in those two distinctions. But it is really scary to navigate a changing federal landscape, changes to Title IX. I saw another question that touched on like issues of Title IX a little bit as well, and thinking about how we can affirm our LGBTQ plus community members, regardless of if laws are changing or confusing, and also before things are enforceable by a federal agency, making sure we're not over complying and making sure that we're not bending to the will of a scary executive order before it's actually enforceable law and legislation. And then Senator Moss, I'll pass it to you.
No, I think you said it exactly right. You know, it's our state civil rights laws, as I mentioned, we protect discrimination from educational institutions as well. So it's about the strength of your state civil rights law as well.
Right. The state, so yes, that's a good point. And the state laws can provide a lot of protection, even if the federal laws aren't. What conversations or relations, this is a question from, I can't tell if this is a question for Rabbi Micah or if this is from a rabbi. For any of the panelists, what conversations or relationships have you had that may have helped people think more broadly and inclusively in this area? So how have you helped open people's mind?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that really jumps out at me is that we are in a time where there is very, very active misinformation circulating with a specific eye towards stoking fear of the transgender and non-binary communities. And a lot of people who are receiving that misinformation, maybe they don't actually know a trans person or don't know that they know a trans person. And part of what I have found really effective in the work that I do in trainings, in consultations, and working with communities is first and foremost taking a moment to slow down the conversation, taking a moment to speak as sort of a real live person myself, to share the pieces of my story that feel like they are effective and teachable without being vulnerable in the wrong way, right? I have a teacher who's very fond of saying, remember, we always teach from our scars, not our wounds. And really helping just make real for them the stakes of the misinformation that is out there, not sort of in some theoretical way, what might this mean to a person I've never met, but how does it actually play out in somebody's true and real day-to-day life? One of the examples that I use a lot, I am actually very much in one of those more conservative states that somebody mentioned in the chat. I'm based in Missouri, and there was a lot of discussion this legislative season, and I want to be very clear, it did not happen because most of the anti-trans legislation that is discussed or proposed is shut down before it becomes reality. But some of what was under discussion were questions around preventing people from accessing driver's licenses that correctly reflect their gender. And one of the ways that I found very effective to tell the story when people would wonder, but like, isn't that, we shouldn't touch that, it's too political, this isn't a conversation we feel comfortable having, is sort of reminding people, you know, I didn't choose to make it a political act to put my kids in the car and drive to the grocery store to buy more apples because that's the fruit of the day. Somebody else might have chosen to make that political by asking the question of whether I should be allowed to have a driver's license to do it. But when we're talking about these questions of sort of why are we even having this conversation, making it real, making it concrete, and making it human and relatable, I have found to be the most effective tools that I have in my toolbox.
That's a great example that, you know, you're just living your life going to the grocery store.
I also don't think that political is a bad word. But when people wonder, what does it mean, especially in a congregational or religious setting, to engage in civic affairs, we do really want to make a distinction for them between partisan and an issue that impacts everyone, right? That those are very different things.
I also wanted to add a resource in the chat that we use at Keshet. I co-facilitate a coalition called Thrive, which is the Jewish Coalition to Protect Trans Youth. We work on moving positive legislation on a state-by-state basis and combating anti-trans legislation as well. And we are comprised of over 340 Jewish organizations and institutions that come together to really talk about being a coordinated Jewish strategy to combat anti-trans legislation. All that to say is that we have a resource called combating anti-trans legislation through a Jewish lens. And one of the ways we talk about this is really framing our shared values, our shared faith, right? Yes, important to uplift that Jews for a Secular Democracy is a member of Thrive, really a partner in the work with us. So grateful for that. And one of the things we can say is, right, okay, like let's say you're arguing that trans women shouldn't be athletes or something like that, right? You're like, oh, so it seems like you really are worried about like children's sports or protecting children. And you can kind of go down to the baseline. What are you worried about here? I affirm that you care about fairness. Let's unpack what that means in a really lived out way, because is it fair for someone of a gender minority to have a different experience when playing sports, when it's played out? So if you go back to the values, you can really find a lot of common ground on these issues. And yes, we invite you to join Thrive. Thanks for the link, Katie. And I also hope you take a gander at this anti-trans legislation talking point resource. It can help you really connect with people who maybe you haven't had the words previously to talk about this with.
Well, that sounds like a great resource, and thank you very much for sharing that. And that brings me to another question, which I'm going to at least start with Senator Moss, but I want this, jump in, anybody. So there are a lot of lawmakers and constituents who believe that the anti-LGBTQ laws are there to protect families or to preserve tradition or, to uphold family values that are near and dear to them. So I want, how do you address that?
So number one, the moral case should be enough. And obviously, I think most of the people on here, if not all the people on here, believe there's a moral case to treat people equally, to not discriminate, to welcome people of diverse backgrounds. So the moral case should be enough. But one thing that we did when we pushed forward on the Civil Rights Amendment is we made an economic case. I'm not making this political, but the reality is we were in a Democratic majority, but we wanted to make a case for those who are more conservative or aligned on the Republican side of the aisle. It was causing economic harm to discriminate against LGBTQ people. Essentially, we were kicking people out of our economy as employees and consumers. And so it was this the economic case to be made was very compelling. We had support for equality from our chambers of commerce, which lean right, from other business groups, which may not necessarily be on the liberal flank, from our largest employers who said, we need to be competitive and we can't we can't stop recruitment at the borders of our state because somebody might feel that they're prone to or vulnerable to discrimination. So sometimes you have to meet people where they're at. The moral case should be enough, but we made this as an economic case. And kind of fusing the last question into this answer too, what have you done to kind of move the needle? Showing up every day as your complete and full self makes a huge difference. I subscribe to this Harvey Milk quote that coming out is the most political thing you can do wherever you are to change hearts and minds. So when somebody may have been raised to believe a certain way, but then Joe and John are their neighbors and are in a happy marriage and raising children, they're playing in the street with their children. That's what makes almost all the difference on some of these issues that may divide us.
So if possible, and I'd like to get everyone's input on this, what does true religious freedom look like? And how is that different than what's being claimed in today's anti-LGBTQ policies? What is true religious freedom?
I
Whoever
think
wants.
I think Senator Moss touched on this a bit is equal protection under the law, right? The freedom to exist and not have faith imposed on others or have your own rights restricted. And also just feeling legitimized in the public sphere. And that also means culturally, right? Having a cultural norm, whether that is in our Jewish communal spaces or more broadly, that really values all identity and uplifts LGBTQ plus community members in our experiences. And as a queer Jew, like I just want to say it's so possible to live in deep alignment with tradition and also affirming the dignity of all people. So I think that making those two things feel in conflict takes away from the sentiment of religious freedom.
So somebody put in the question that they substitute teach in a really Christian district, and there are almost every teacher, it's a public school, I gather from this, almost every teacher has a cross on their desk. So it's on their own personal desk. Is that religious freedom, or is that religious intimidation of non-Christian students? What do you think, Rabbi Micah?
Say, I don't know that I'm prepared to say that categorically a situation that I haven't seen with my own eyes is this or is that, but here's something that I think I'll share. I have a friend who used to work in City Hall in a municipality, and every year they would put up this very, very tall tree in December, Christmas tree, and ornaments and the presents and the tinsel, and there was a train that would go by it. And that was the only display that was put up. And so one year, somebody asked this friend of mine, would you like to put up a menorah next to the tree? So she went and she asked the city manager, can a menorah go next to the tree when December comes around? And was told, no, we have separation of church and state. We can't practice religion in a space like City Hall. And what that really highlighted for me was that what was at play was actually in some ways even harder and more subtle to work through with folks. The understanding that actually displays of religion are specific, right? This notion, sort of the place where people were coming from wasn't one religion in their conscious belief. One religion is better or truer than others, but this is just cultural. It's not religious, right? As someone I think earlier said in the chat, don't we know that Christianity is very diverse and there are so many different ways of practicing? So this is just cultural. And that actually was a harder thing to lean on. So I don't know if that's what's happening in this particular community, but that was an even harder thing to explain that, actually it might be shared culture among some groups, but it's not just cultural, all or none. So the question that I would have is it safe also for somebody who practices a different faith, Judaism or Islam, to bring their symbols of faith with them? Is it safe for somebody who is atheist to have symbols of the moral guidelines and guideposts that are important and relevant and centered to them? And are those received both officially and interpersonally in the same way as a teacher who chooses to put a cross on their desk? Right? That's the test, Senator Moss, that you alluded to before. All of them or none?
Yeah. So how are Jewish institutions or faith communities responding or struggling to respond to all of these challenges that are coming recently with all the huge attacks that we see coming from the federal government?
I want to take a moment to really uplift that in these moments of really intense fear and polarization, and we don't know what's going to happen next, this political hostility that really permeates and is felt in our bodies. And Jews are showing up right now. And I can say for Keshet, we've never been busier. I mean, I actually have only been at Keshet for 3 years, so I can't really say never, but I've never had so many people come across my desk and say, what can I do right now? And that is really giving me hope in this moment, is seeing the way that people are invigorated to show up. People have better understanding of LGBTQ plus identity and an understanding of how these threats really manifest in a real way for our community, and want to get involved in advocacy efforts for our Thrive Coalition. We've had so many sign-ons this year since the change in the administration. We had a advocacy push called the Jewish Pledge to affirm the dignity of trans, non-binary, and intersex people. And on this pledge, we asked for people to sign on saying that, yes, they affirm the dignity of trans people, but also that they will do X, Y, and Z to take action on behalf of that affirmation. And so we had over 550 people sign that pledge, and I can share it with you all now. And I urge you to sign on as well. But just a message that amidst all this scariness and fear and uncertainty, people really are mobilizing right now to be involved and to move the needle.
That's great. And Lanie, I'm going to come back to that point because in a few minutes, we're going to talk about action steps. And I definitely, want to hear more about the pledge. And I'm sure that there are many people here who are going to want to know exactly how they can sign it. Rabbi Micah, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, a strong echo there. The Jewish community is showing up in powerful, powerful ways. Not all of our organizations yet, but I believe that there is solid and strong momentum, and that people are really seeing what the stakes are for so many members of our communities.
Mm-hmm. So I know Senator Moss gave the most famous, his favorite quote from the Bible, which is also, for many religions, that we should do unto others as we would like unto ourselves. But are there any other Jewish texts that you can lean on to help people see why this is a Jewish issue?
That's got to be a question for the rabbi, right?
It is a question for the rabbi, but he hasn't unmuted, so maybe he doesn't want to answer.
So many. So one very short way that I can answer, and I'm going to share, wait, I need to switch it to send to everyone right here in the chat. We have a resource called 7 Jewish Values for Taking Action that really outlines some of the very sort of short and sweet texts that we at Keshet like to lean on when we think about, why does it matter to me what is happening for the trans community, the non-binary community, the intersex community. So yes, everyone is created in the image of the divine, whatever that word means or doesn't mean to you. This notion of pursuing justice as core to Jewish tradition. One that's really been sitting with me a lot lately is this, in that resource, it's listed as number 3, but there's this text that says, Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, do not stand by or on the blood of your fellow, of your neighbor. And it's taken to mean 2 things, right? One of them is that, first of all, many of us are Jewish and trans at the same time and are impacted very directly. And even for people who aren't, this notion of when something is happening to the person who is in my community, or to the person I don't even know that I know yet, it matters. It matters because that sets the tone, the standard, the way that our community can treat people. And so every one of us has a stake. Another thing about it that really jumps out at me is that in And I'm like going into full-on geek out rabbi mode here, so please stop me and rein me in if you don't want me to do that. But in the verse, the other half of that verse is don't go out as a rachil is the Hebrew word that shows up in the text as a gossip or a talebearer or a slanderer among your people. And actually, very specifically, that word rachil means slander in the sense of misinformation and distortion. And there is this notion that the Jewish traditions pick up on from that verse of, there's actually a deep connection between the hateful speech we might engage in or tolerate about any person or group of people and right? Harm or even bloodshed. And this notion of, it's on us to be active bystanders, upstanders, participants in when we see harm happening as far as the outcome of these attacks and legislative moves. And it is also important for us to be as fiercely involved when it comes to questions of what is the language that we are tolerating being used about members of our communities. And I'm going to climb down off my soapbox right now, but I could talk for an hour on just that text.
And I see that Lanie has disappeared, so I hope we can get her back. And Katie and Paul, will you look for her entering to make sure you elevate her to a panelist when you see her coming back in? A lot of the people who are showing up tonight, I know, have the same question, which is, what can I do? And we always like to talk about action steps. It's great for us to scream into the echo chamber, be with our like-minded people. But what I have two questions that I want, and hopefully Lanie will get back on and be able to answer them too. One is, what is one thing you'd like everyone to take away from this discussion? And two, what I really want to focus on is, what is an action step or more than one action step that you'd like to see everyone take? Like, you have this whole huge room full of activists here. So give us some instruction, whoever wants to start.
No, I think in this moment, and I don't want to, talk about any of the other issues and crises that we're dealing with, but in this moment, this is the time to use your voice. This is the time to speak up. This is the time to tell your story. The way forward is people who are ordinary citizens, living day to day, trying to, make it through, telling their story about some of these threats that are impacting them, standing up a little bit more boldly, and acting, a little bit more outwardly, to hold those who are making decisions to account. I'm one of these people who firmly believes that we should all be in the rooms where decisions about us are being made. And there's a lot of people making decisions about you, whatever that means to you. There's a lot of people making decisions about you right now. And you can either let it happen or you can put your voice in the discussion. So obviously, I'm a state legislator. This is a time, if you see there are policy impacts on your life as a religious minority, as an LGBTQ person, as an LGBTQ ally, this is not the time to back down. This is the time to step up. And tell your story. I really believe that these individual conversations absolutely do make a difference. Sometimes it feels hopeless. Sometimes it feels like government and big decisions move regardless of your participation. No, they move because of your participation. So if you have an email of a legislator that you can send something to, or a phone number, you should be using that. You should be showing up to town halls. You should be showing up to community events. You should be showing up in the streets if there are other activist protests that you want to participate in. Because in this moment where it feels like we're being shut out, now is the time to tag in, because the citizens of this country have a lot more power than the people making decisions if they exercise it.
Lanie, thank you. I'm so glad you were able to come back. Just to catch you up, I'm asking everybody what is, like, if there's one main thing you want people to take away from tonight, and then to really hone in on what actions people can take. I know that you mentioned before, people ask you all the time, what can they do? People call me all the time and say, what can I do? And there's a whole room full of people here who are looking to have some really concrete direction. So while you go ahead, or if you need time to think on it, Rabbi Micah can go first, either way.
Okay, thank you to everyone in the room who wants to take action. That's so exciting. And we invite you to take action alongside us. The link in the chat earlier with the Jewish Pledge for Trans Dignity on it outlines some really straightforward ways for you to call your legislators, as Senator Moss said. Request postcards from us and we'll send them to you, and then you can write your legislators, and also help contribute to real, meaningful cultural institutional changes in the Jewish spaces that you belong in. Rabbi Micah works on our education and training team, and they really help Jewish community spaces become more affirming and supportive. And we can do the same thing by joining Thrive, and then be a part of our advocacy network and get really tangible ways to join our, thanks Micah, to join our advocacy network at Thrive. But so those are the really concrete ways, but some of like the messages that I really want to leave with you all is that when we show up for other people, like, we really are strengthening ourselves, we're strengthening our Jewish communities, we're strengthening our LGBTQ plus communities. Being a part of history and being a part of history of affirming our trans Jewish community members will inherently strengthen our society for the long haul. And that also, courage is contagious. A lot of the times when we have to be courageous and, ask our synagogue to put up a trans Jews belong here flag, that feels scary. But it can ripple out in ways that you might not expect or have the foresight for in that moment. When we take bold action, others will follow. And so all you have to do is start. And that one thing could become a bigger thing and a bigger thing. And then you have contributed to a culture of meaningful change. So yeah, thanks.
Rabbi?
Yes, do all of the things that Senator Moss and that Lanie told you to do. Raise your voice, tell your story, contact all of your lawmakers, national and local, and take the steps inside your communities. And while you're doing that, what I would encourage you to remember is that all of the we on this call right now, right? The LGBTQ plus community, the Jewish community, the community of activists and advocates and change makers who show up for a call like this, we already have the tools, the resilience, and the community and the source of hope to make it through this moment.
So Rabbi Moss, Rabbi, I've combined you. I've made you a rabbi, Senator. You said if you have a phone number or an email for your legislator, contact them. Okay, what if you don't know who your legislator is, or who they are, or how to contact them? Can you give us some guidance?
Sure, Google's a good tool to use. But to be honest with you, I mean, even if you've never done this before, and I see there's a question about being uncomfortable to call your elected representative. We get calls all the time in our office from constituents who are calling for the first time. If you're a good legislator, it is your job to be responsive. It's your job hear from people, even people with diverse views. I've seen some talk in the chat about being maybe from a conservative community and you don't think you're going to get anywhere. Well, you don't get anywhere if you don't make the ask, if you don't represent yourself and ask for that to be represented by people who are elected to make decisions on your behalf. So this is how this country works. This country is driven by people who stand up and speak out. And in this moment in particularly, we need more people to stand up and speak out. So I really would start with, a good resource, because there's so many different, people in different places represented here, is really just Google Google, who's your hometown state representative? What issues are going on? I think people are probably plugged into what's going on in their community. I'm telling you that calling makes a difference. Emailing makes a difference. And it may make one person think differently about an issue, a representative to think differently about an issue if they're hearing from somebody that's directly impacted. So do not put your politicians on a pedestal. We do not deserve it. Please feel free to break down those barriers and demand representation, because these people make decisions on your behalf. Surely you should be telling them what you're going through so that they can be better informed to make those decisions.
So, Senator, is it worth your time to call a legislator who already agrees with you, or on the other hand, who is absolutely on the opposite side of the fence from you?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
The legislator who is going to vote the way you want them to, it's helpful for me to say to my colleagues, I've heard from 75 constituents who feel this way. Or for me to be able to pull a story from the district and say, hey, I heard from this person who's going through this thing, and this is why I'm voting this way. So it's very important to call somebody, even if you know that they are going to vote that way, so that they can be armed with information from the district to be able to make the case for their vote. And if they disagree with you, absolutely they need to hear from you. Even if you know that they're a lost hope on some of these issues that we've been talking about and more, it is so important for them to know that there's a dissent in their district, that all the views in their district are not a monolith. Maybe it will make them grapple a little bit to come to a conclusion and come to a decision. So it is very valuable for people to contact their legislator, even if they know they are fully firmly on one side or the other.
So this is also the perfect segue for me to tell you all that Jews for a Secular Democracy is going to be starting in June, having a regular lunchtime, depending on where you live, a call with us time where we are going to talk about a specific issue. Then we're going to give a training on how to call your legislator. This is going to be great if people are intimidated and afraid to do it. We're going to do role plays and really make sure people are ready to call their legislators, and then we're going to all call our legislators together. So this is a program called Call With Us that Jews for a Secular Democracy is starting next month, and we definitely are going to keep in touch with you about that. I also want to say that if anybody is having trouble getting contact information for their legislator, I'm happy to help no matter where you live. If you don't find it on Google, send me an email, give me your address, and I'll find it for you. And we have just a couple more minutes. I see somebody saying, I'm calling you, Jeremy.
Well,
There
she's
you
a
go.
constituent of mine. So Julia, you can call anytime.
She is a constituent of yours. She's gonna keep you honest. Does anybody have any final words that they would like to add, that they'd like to leave with? All right, I'm gonna go to each of you then. Okay, starting with you, Rabbi Micah.
Thank you all so much for being here, for spending an evening with us, whichever time zone you're in. I know that time is very precious, and it matters so much that you're showing up to this space to learn, to understand some tools, and to be ready to take action.
Lanie.
Just echoing that sentiment of gratitude. Thank you for taking this wonderful hour to spend time with us. And I guess I'll just leave you with an action prompt to pick a space that you're part of, a Jewish space you're part of, start a conversation, ask the question, what are we doing to make sure the LGBTQ plus people in our community feel celebrated in this space and feel a true sense of belonging? And based on the gaps that you might identify, use Keshet's resources to follow up on implementing a solution or something new or expanding. And please be in touch if you want to talk more about doing so.
And Senator Moss, I'll give you the final word.
Yeah, no, this is a moment that's going to call on all of us to step up. and take action. We're living through an era. You know, I don't know what it will be called when we get past this era, but we're living through a historic era. And this era will be defined by those who spoke out and worked to ensure we got through it and we're better off on the other side. So this is not a moment to sit back and watch this all pass us by. This is a moment to get in the game.
Thank you. And I'll end with saying what I always say, that we will never have religious freedom without the separation of religion and government, and that until all of our rights are protected, that none of us are safe. And I thank all of you for coming. Thank you, Senator Moss. Thank you, Lanie Cohen. Thank you, Rabbi Micah. And I thank you to all of our co-sponsors again. And we will have this up on YouTube in, I'm not sure when, but we'll send you an email as soon as it's up. It usually takes about a week. Thank you again.
And thank you, Nomi.
Thank you.